2022 Trafficking in Persons report, Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking but is making significant efforts to do so. These efforts included prosecuting more potential trafficking crimes, convicting more traffickers, increasing training for law enforcement officials on the distinctions between human trafficking and migrant smuggling, drafting regulations to create a victim protection fund, and conducting awareness campaigns at the federal and regional levels on trafficking indicators and reporting mechanisms. However, the government did not demonstrate overall increasing efforts compared with the previous reporting period. Prosecution. The government increased anti-trafficking law enforcement efforts but did not take adequate steps to address official complicity in trafficking crimes. Proclamation 1178/2020, Proclamation to provide for the prevention and suppression of trafficking in persons and the smuggling of persons, as amended by Corrigendum 11/2013, effective as of December 2020, criminalized sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The law prescribed penalties of 7 to 15 years imprisonment and a fine of 20,000 to 100,000 Ethiopian birr, BR, $407 to $2,040, for labor trafficking and adult sex trafficking, and 10 to 20 years imprisonment and a fine of 30,000 to 100,000 BR, $610 to $2,040, for child sex trafficking. These penalties were sufficiently stringent and, with regards to sex trafficking, commensurate with those prescribed for other serious crimes, such as rape. In 2021, the government provided data from the federal level in 6 regions, compared with providing data from the federal level in 3 regions in 2020. The government reported investigating 495 potential trafficking cases, 487 for sex trafficking and 8 for forced labor, in 2021, compared with 172 investigations in 2020. The government did not disaggregate by type of trafficking in the previous reporting period. Of these 495 case investigations, officials investigated 127 at the federal level and 368 at the regional level, compared with 27 at the federal level and 145 at the regional level in 2020. The government reported prosecuting 387 individuals, 353 for sex trafficking, 5 for forced labor, and 29 for unspecified exploitation, in 2021, compared with 108 prosecutions in 2020. Of the 387 individuals prosecuted, 98 occurred at the federal level, and 289 occurred at the regional level, compared with 5 prosecutions at the federal level and 103 at the regional level in 2020. Officials prosecuted 267 of these individuals under the Anti-Trafficking Proclamation and 120 under the Criminal Code. Courts convicted 296 traffickers, 289 for sex trafficking and 7 for forced labor, in 2021, compared with 48 convictions in 2020. Of the 296 convictions, 190 were under the 2020 Anti-Trafficking Proclamation, and 106 were under the Criminal Code. The government did not report sentencing data. Courts acquitted 8 suspected traffickers during the reporting period for unspecified reasons. For all prosecutions and convictions under the Criminal Code, the government reported using Article 243 related to unlawful departure, entry, or residence, rather than trafficking provisions. As reported in prior years, officials' propensity to conflate human trafficking and migrant smuggling made it probable that some reported cases involved individuals seeking to illegally cross international borders via irregular migration and other crimes not involving exploitation through forced labor or sex trafficking. Additionally, financial and capacity constraints continued to impede data collection by regional police, and ineffective coordination between the regions and the federal government hindered law enforcement efforts. The government did not report any investigations, prosecutions, or convictions of government employees complicit in human trafficking crimes. However, corruption and official complicity in trafficking crimes remain significant concerns, inhibiting law enforcement action during the year. Corruption among police and judicial officials, especially the solicitation of bribes, remained a significant concern. The government maintained victim protection efforts. The government reported identifying 329 trafficking victims, compared with 0 in the previous reporting period. Of the 329 victims identified, traffickers exploited 289 in sex trafficking and 40 in forced labor. The government reported 191 of the sex trafficking victims and 36 of the forced labor victims were girls, and the remaining 102 victims were unspecified. In previous years, the government reported the number of individuals returning to Ethiopia it considered to be vulnerable to trafficking. The government did not report this number in 2021, compared with more than 14,518 vulnerable migrants in 2020. The government maintained SOPs for proactive victim identification and provided regular trainings on its use. However, officials' dissemination and implementation of the SOPs remained limited. The government had an NRM outlining guidelines for victim referrals to services. However, its use remained limited, particularly outside of Addis Ababa. In 2021, the government developed a Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) with regional states to expand the NRM's use across the country. The MOU was awaiting regional officials' signatures at the end of the reporting period. The government, in partnership with civil society organizations, reported providing 256 victims, all women and girls, with various services, including medical care, psychosocial counseling, shelter, family reunification, legal aid, and economic assistance. The government did not report protection data related to the remaining 73 identified victims. There continued to be a dearth of care available for male trafficking victims. Despite reliance on civil society organizations to provide most victim services, the government did not report providing financial or in-kind support to such organizations. Officials continued to jointly operate 5 migration response centers, MRCs, in partnership with an international organization, in Dire Dawa, Metemma, Moyale, Semra, and Togakale. The government supported the MRCs in various ways, including by donating land for infrastructure, providing rent-free usage of government facilities, participating in MRC management committees, and facilitating referral linkage with frontline agencies. The government reported providing services to 199 trafficking victims at the MRCs during the reporting period. The government maintained operation of child protection units in Addis Ababa and several major cities. The units reportedly provided protection services to child trafficking victims and vulnerable children intercepted or identified en route from rural to urban areas. The 2020 Anti-Trafficking Proclamation established a fund to support victim protection and care, which could receive funding through a government budget allocation, through fines imposed on, and the sale of, confiscated property from traffickers, and from foreign donors. In 2021, the government drafted regulations to initiate creation of the fund. The regulations were awaiting ministerial-level approval at the end of the reporting period. To protect Ethiopian nationals exploited abroad, some Ethiopian diplomatic missions in Gulf states continued to provide temporary shelter and facilitate repatriation flights for victims. The government and civil society continued to report that Gulf states conducted mass deportations of Ethiopians, rather than coordinated repatriations, due to pandemic-related stigmatization of migrants and economic impacts among employers. The number of deportations continued at a significant rate, hindering the Ethiopian response system. Protection services for returnees, including potential trafficking victims, also remained limited. Officials at Bole International Airport and at land border crossings coordinated with an international organization to screen Ethiopians returning from abroad for trafficking indicators. Observers noted the time allotted for screening interviews, approximately 5 minutes, was insufficient to identify potential victims, especially amidst the high number of returnees, which an international organization reported was more than 155,000 individuals in 2021. The 2020 Anti-Trafficking Proclamation provided protections to victims participating in investigations and prosecutions as outlined under the Witness and Whistleblowers Protection Proclamation, No. 699/2010, which included protection from prosecution for crimes committed as a direct result of unlawful acts traffickers compelled them to commit. The government reported most victims participated in criminal proceedings against traffickers, noting that officials received victims' informed consent. Officials maintained an MOU with NGOs to improve coordination between law enforcement agencies and service providers intended to ensure officials referred victims to appropriate care, including shelter, counseling, and legal assistance, throughout the course of legal proceedings. Courts allowed children to testify against traffickers via video or in child-friendly interviewing rooms. Despite these protections, observers reported, in some cases, victims chose not to testify due to fear of reprisal or lack of funding to travel to court. The government reported the Specialized Witness Protection Unit, established in 2018, provided some protection services to victims' witnesses. However, the government did not provide information on specific actions taken by the unit. Proclamation 1178/2020 allowed foreign national victims to receive temporary residence permits or repatriation assistance on an as-needed basis, but the government did not report whether any victims received deportation relief. The anti-trafficking proclamation entitled victims to restitution from convicted traffickers. However, the government did not report awarding restitution during the reporting period. Due to disparate implementation of identification procedures, authorities may have detained or deported some unidentified trafficking victims. Prevention: the government maintained efforts to prevent trafficking. The Senior-Level National Council, NC, chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister, maintained responsibility for the creation of policies and strategies for the prevention of migrant smuggling and human trafficking, and it was mandated to meet twice per year. The NC met once in 2021. The Working Level National Partnership Coalition, NPC, which was led by the Ministry of Justice and composed of members from relevant government ministries, religious institutions, civil society organizations, and media, continued to serve as the government's primary coordinating body for issues related to human trafficking and migrant smuggling. The NPC established 6 working groups, which met regularly throughout the year, related to the following topics: awareness raising and overseas employment, crime prevention and law enforcement, victim protection, data collection, diaspora engagement, and research. The government remained without a comprehensive anti-trafficking NAP for the 6th consecutive year. The NPC launched a 2021 to 2025 strategic plan, which included activities related to the prevention of human trafficking and migrant smuggling among Ethiopian overseas workers. The government reported seeking input from survivors, including women, children, and persons with disabilities, in developing new anti-trafficking laws, policies, and programs. The government, in partnership with international organizations and foreign donors, conducted various awareness campaigns at the federal and regional levels on trafficking indicators and reporting mechanisms, primarily targeted towards schools, rural communities, religious institutions, and media. The government, in partnership with an international organization, conducted awareness activities related to the prevention of the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers in Tigray. The government did not operate a trafficking-specific hotline. However, the government reported referring 151 potential trafficking cases identified through police hotlines to law enforcement and service providers. The government remained without a coordinated national data collection system, resulting in disorganized reporting on information related to trafficking. In June 2021, the government amended the 2016 Employment Proclamation through Proclamation No. 1246/2021 Ethiopians Overseas Employment Amendment. The revised proclamation newly required the establishment of an employment board, composed of representatives from relevant government agencies, to oversee the implementation of the proclamation, including by facilitating bilateral labor agreements, BLA, protecting migrant workers abroad, and raising awareness of overseas employment processes and risks. The government did not operationalize the board by the end of the reporting period. The Employment Proclamation continued to require employment agencies to deposit $1 million branch, $20,350, in a bank as insurance, which officials would use to assist and repatriate trafficking victims. However, the government did not report enforcing this requirement for the 3rd consecutive reporting period. Proclamation No. 1426/2021 newly required migrant workers, not including those employed in domestic work, to pay employment agencies the amount of 1 month's salary over 4 payment periods. The then Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, now the Ministry of Labor and Skills, trained 13 labor officers in 2019 to serve abroad as foreign service officers and represent Ethiopians working in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. However, the government had not yet deployed the labor officers due to pandemic-related travel restrictions. The government reported an international organization provided continued training to the labor officers as deployment remained delayed. The government maintained BLAs with Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to commit to ethical recruitment, legal remedies against those who violated the law, and equal protection of Ethiopian workers, to include equal wages for equal work and reasonable working hours. Ethiopian officials maintained efforts to implement a 2012 law requiring registration of all births nationwide. However, the lack of a uniform national identity card continued to impede implementation of the law and allowed for the continuous issuance of district-level identity cards, which were subject to fraudulent production to exploit potential trafficking victims, including children. The government cooperated with a foreign donor to provide Ethiopian troops with anti-trafficking training prior to their deployment abroad on international peacekeeping missions. Although not explicitly reported as human trafficking, the UN reported one allegation of sexual exploitation with trafficking indicators by one Ethiopian peacekeeper serving in the UN peacekeeping operation in Abyei in 2020. The government did not report investigating the allegation for the second consecutive reporting period. Investigation and accountability actions remained pending for a similar allegation against one Ethiopian peacekeeper serving in the UN peacekeeping mission in Liberia in 2018. The government did not make efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex acts.